If any of you missed my introduction this morning, I'm Karen Kafitz. I'm a program manager at the Delta Science program, and I'm going to introduce the practice of adaptive management planning session. I'll use this introductory talk to tell you more about the work that my staff and I do to provide support and leadership for the use of science-based adaptive management to achieve the co-equal goals. So what does it mean to practice adaptive management? Adaptive management is a science-based, structured approach to improving our understanding of the problems and uncertainties of environmental and water management. It's a systematic approach for improving natural resource management by learning from the outcomes of the actions that we take to modify the environment. The concept of adaptive management explicitly links learning with policy and implementation. Many resource planning documents call for the use of adaptive management. For example, the Delta Plan, which uses a 3-phase, 9-step adaptive management framework pictured here. Many managers refer to adaptive management as part of their processes. However, contrary to common belief, adaptive management is much more than simply tracking and changing management directions in the face of failed actions. Adaptive management requires that projects clearly identify and articulate their goals and the measurable objectives that they'll use to evaluate progress towards those goals. Adaptive management includes exploring pathways to meet management objectives and predicting the outcomes of alternatives based on conceptual and numerical models. It requires implementing one of those alternatives or more than one, and monitoring to learn about the impacts of management actions, and then using the results to update knowledge and to adjust management actions on that project or elsewhere on the landscape. Adaptive management is explicitly focused on this process of learning and adapting, and requires partnerships of managers, scientists, and other stakeholders who learn together how to create and maintain sustainable environmental systems. In this adaptive management forum over the next 3 days, we're going to hear about many of the practices and mechanisms people have put into place in order to facilitate adaptive management. We're also going to hear about many of the partnerships and support structures that make adaptive management possible. And we're going to hear stories of learning and adapting. Today, day 1, we'll start with the practice of adaptive management planning. The first 4 lightning talks in this session present stories of the first crucial phase of adaptive management, coming up with a plan and writing it all down. This is the phase where we must clearly articulate our goals and objectives, explore our current understanding to identify what we don't know and what we do know, and propose alternative ways of solving our problem based on our imperfect understanding of the socio-ecological systems that we're manipulating. An adaptive management plan is where we write down what we think will happen, how we think we'll know if it's happening, and what we'll do if it doesn't happen like we thought. The 5th lightning talk in this session will take us on a deeper dive into designing a data management strategy, one of the most critical and challenging components of modern environmental project management. This is where we start the forum, because without a plan, we're not doing adaptive management. Not even so much because the document is important, though it is, but because the process of building it is important. The process of building a shared understanding of our goals, of agreeing on how we think actions will translate into beneficial environmental outcomes, of agreeing on what we think it will take to know that we're achieving our goals, and then writing it all down, sharing it with others, revising it, sharing it again, revising it again. It's this process that catalyzes our best problem solving. It's this process that ensures that we're using the best available science as a foundation for our planning, and that we're producing the best possible science to inform adaptation and design future projects. So I'm going to talk a bit more about some of the structures that exist in the system to support the process of adaptive management planning. I'll start here with 3 of the primary venues that are explicitly focused on workshopping adaptive management plans as they're being created. I'll point out that this slide is biased to highlight structures in the Delta and Sassoon Marsh because those are the jurisdictions in which my team and I do our work. I'll briefly touch on a similar structure that's focused on the Bay, but also acknowledge that I may have overlooked something. I'll start with the Delta-focused Interagency Adaptive Management Integration Team, which we refer to as IMET. The IMET is a group convened by the Delta Science Program and made up of scientific and technical staff from local, state, and federal agencies and certain key stakeholder groups that have roles in implementing, funding, regulating, or otherwise supporting and overseeing adaptive management of projects in the Delta. It serves as a technical team that provides input and guidance on adaptive management for current and future efforts at a high level that cross-cuts individual agency missions. Project managers are encouraged to use this venue to discuss their project, resolve issues that they're experiencing, and receive technical and regulatory feedback on project development. In this way, the IMET can act as a forum for informal joint consultation, a single venue for project review and advice to facilitate meeting regulatory and adaptive management needs. The hope is to create efficiencies for project proponents, to enhance coordination between agencies, and to increase pathways for integrating adaptive management into projects. Some of the roles that the group plays are to offer support and technical guidance to project proponents with inquiries related to adaptive management planning or implementation, to review project designs and advise project proponents on how to increase chances of achieving project objectives and minimize adverse effects, to advise on the use of standardized monitoring protocols, to discuss how project designs and monitoring plans may be able to address scientific uncertainties in order to help inform future restoration projects, identify potential connections to researchers that may help projects address uncertainties that are outside the scope of that individual project's monitoring plan, or which could facilitate the development of active adaptive management studies at the project site. And finally, the IMET welcomes presentations from projects post-construction and in the monitoring phases on lessons learned, so that those lessons can be considered and applied in future consultations and for updating conceptual models. The IMET has also developed a website that hosts a variety of resources to support adaptive management planning in the system, including example plans, information on regulatory requirements for adaptive management, a compilation of existing landscape level conceptual models, a compendium of monitoring frameworks, and links to a variety of environmental data resources that can be used for project planning. My staff will post a link to the website in the chat if you'd like to check it out. The next group I'd like to talk about is the Sassoon Adaptive Management Advisory Team, or AMAT. The Sassoon AMAT is one of several groups supporting implementation of the Sassoon Marsh Habitat Management, Preservation, and Restoration Plan, known by short as the Sassoon Marsh Plan. This is a 30-year comprehensive plan that addresses habitats and ecological processes, public and private land use, levee system integrity, and water quality through tidal restoration and managed wetland activities in the marsh. The plan's purpose is to create a balance between protection and enhancement of managed wetlands and the restoration and protection of tidal wetlands. The Sassoon AMAT's purpose is to support the application of adaptive management in the implementation of the Sassoon Marsh Plan. The AMAT meets quarterly and invites projects to come give presentations to the group at 4 phases in their planning process. Phase 1, right after acquiring the property and while working on the concept design. At this time, experts in the group provide peer review of project design and work to inform early adaptive management decisions using the best available science as understood by the experts in the group. At this phase, projects also receive support in thinking about science and research that could be done at the site. Subsequent check-ins occur at 40% design and 95% design to continue to address potential adaptive management opportunities and discuss and coordinate on monitoring requirements for various permits. In the final phase, projects present about lessons learned 1 year and 3 to 5 years post-construction. These presentations help the AMAT group to take lessons learned and apply them as appropriate to other Sassoon Marsh projects, and continue to coordinate in an interagency context on facilitating adaptive management across the restoration projects. In addition to meeting with projects, the Sassoon AMAT also supports the adaptive management of the Sassoon Marsh Plan by tracking the evolving state of knowledge on key management uncertainties that are identified in the plan and updating underlying conceptual models based on new scientific information coming from research or from restoration project monitoring. The group also assists the agencies with tracking the achievement of the restoration target goals of the Sassoon Marsh Plan overall. Finally, I'd like to talk about Delta Plan Consistency Early Consultation and the services provided by my staff, the Delta Science Program Adaptive Management Liaisons. Ecosystem and water management projects taking place in the Delta and Sassoon Marsh will typically be required to demonstrate consistency with the Delta Plan, including meeting the requirements of having an adaptive management plan. The Delta Stewardship Council has staff who specialize in meeting with project proponents to assist them in aligning their projects with the regulatory policies of the Delta Plan. Several of these staff, referred to as the Adaptive Management Liaisons, work specifically to support projects as they prepare their adaptive management plans. For example, these staff are trained to provide advice on the availability of conceptual models and numerical models, the regional monitoring activities that may be relevant to a project, relevant research projects and recent findings from research that can be useful to aid the project in their planning or their adaptive management. They can provide advice on potential active adaptive management experiments that could resolve key uncertainties for that project or for related projects. They may also be able to advise on potential funding avenues for research and help make connections with other relevant research efforts. They work with both of the other groups that I just mentioned to help connect projects to those groups as appropriate. And I'll say just by the way that to connect with any of these groups, you can reach me and the Delta Science Program Adaptive Management Liaisons at adaptivemanagement@deltacouncil.ca.gov. I'm going to briefly mention that there are many other collaborative spaces to support components of adaptive management, such as the development of conceptual models and monitoring frameworks, or organizing thinking around a specific set of projects. I don't have the time to talk about all these different venues, but here are a few examples that you may have heard of. The Collaborative Science and Adaptive Management Program, CSAMP, and its Collaborative Adaptive Management Team, CAMPT, focus on science and adaptive management issues related to the current and future biological opinions for the operations of the State Water Project and the Central Valley Project. This really includes science underlying the specific water management and habitat restoration enhancement actions listed in those biological opinions, which are focused primarily on improving the resilience of delta smelt and salmonids, two of the special status species in our system. The Fish Agency Strategy Team, or FAST, works directly with habitat restoration projects that are seeking crediting towards the restoration requirements of those biological opinions for delta smelt and salmonids for the operations of the state and federal water projects. One of the requirements for crediting is a long-term monitoring and management plan where projects lay out their approaches to evaluating the achievement of project objectives and adaptive management actions that may occur to ensure continued habitat benefits to protected species. And the FAST meets for interagency review of those plans, among other components. And then finally, I'll mention the Bay Restoration Regulatory Integration Team, or BRIT. This team is not explicitly focused on adaptive management, but operates similarly to the IMET, the Sassoon AMAT, and the FAST, in that it brings multiple regulators together to coordinate on permitting for multi-benefit habitat restoration projects in the Bay and associated flood management and public access infrastructure. I hope this has been a useful overview of some of the collaborative structures that support adaptive management planning processes in the Bay Delta system. I'm excited to hand it off now to our lightning talk speakers to tell you more about their experiences actually preparing adaptive management and data management plans. So as I wrap up, let's talk flow for a second. The lightning talks are pre-recorded and are going to play back to back now without interruption from me. Once the last talk is over, we're going to go live with all the speakers in the session for a group Q&A session. You're welcome, as you were doing before, to type a question in the chat, or you can use the raise hand button to get in the queue and ask a question live. We'll take about 15 minutes to do the panel questions, and then at 11:40, we're going to send you off into breakout rooms for 20 more minutes of informal discussion and networking time. The rooms are randomly assigned and you'll be whisked in automatically. Each room will have a moderator and we have a couple of prepared discussion prompts. Depending on the mood of your room, you can use the discussion prompts to stimulate conversation, or you can raise your own topics related to the session or the forum overall. We're not taking detailed notes on the breakout discussions, but we welcome you to jot down 1 or 2 key takeaways and post them to the mural board. We'll send another link to the mural board via chat to all the discussion rooms. We'll also send those discussion prompts by chat to all the discussion rooms, so you'll have that right at your fingertips. So that's it for me. I'll ask my support team to start playing through the lightning talks.
Morning, and thanks for coming to this first lightning talk. I'm Brittany Davis from California Department of Water Resources. I'm going to be giving some highlights of adaptive planning for the North Delta Food Subsidy Action. How did this action start? Well, the San Francisco estuary has low pelagic biomass and productivity. It's been declining since the mid-1970s. This decrease in productivity has affected other levels of the food web, and it's hypothesized to be a main factor contributing to the decline in fish food and native fishes such as Delta smelt. Regionally, however, there are some areas that can provide a good source of food to the Delta, but often summer-fall habitat conditions can limit their benefits. One of those regions is the Yola Bypass. During winter and spring, when the floodplain is inundated, food is transported downstream to the Delta. During summer and fall, with high diversion rates in the bypass, flows are actually reversed. This transports food away from the downstream areas of the estuary where we want it. WR came up with the idea for the flow action after observing some unusual flows in 2011 and 2012, where large agricultural flow pulses in the bypass were followed by downstream Delta plankton bloom. This led to the study objectives: to use existing infrastructure to redirect water through the Yola bypass, and to create positive outflow to increase food web productivity, redistribute waters, and transport food to downstream regions to benefit Delta smelt. DWR takes an adaptive management approach to annually plan, implement, and evaluate this action. The action requires a lot of coordination with several agencies, reclamation districts, and local landowners. During planning, we identify all stakeholders, we engage them in the project, and understand all interests. Planning meetings for deciding on the managed flow action are based on a combination of factors, including water year type, water availability, coordination abilities, and consideration of high priority projects in the area that might impact the action, such as construction or restoration. Concurrent with planning operations, DWR develops a work plan that describes the science and monitoring activities that will be conducted to evaluate the managed flow pulse effects on water quality and biota. A work plan is shared that describes project objectives, predictions, sampling design, approaches to analysis, and how the project is adaptively managed. We then hold stakeholder meetings where work plans are shared for feedback, and we address concerns during this planning stage. During the study period, we implement coordinated operations to generate the flow pulse, and we monitor water quality and biota across regions. Following each action, We take a comparative approach to evaluate the effects of the pulse on water quality and the food web by comparing parameters before, during, and after the pulse, comparing regional habitats and historical trends, and modeling with and without the pulse. There are many challenges with managing this action. The annual cycle is really tight for planning. We're often adapting on the fly. There's uncertainty in water year type, precipitation, water available for the action, agency coordination, land use, external delta requirements, and consideration of other species management. Also, because the spatial scope is so large, there's a lot of operation structures within the area that may need repairs or construction that can delay the action timing or lead to no action at all. Below is a summary of 6 years of planning this action, and due to some of these described influences, we've only conducted 3 actions today. For even 2021, it's unclear if it's a dry or critically dry year, what the plan might be. Some of the key lessons learned on this project in adaptive planning are focused on what went well. Our study demonstrated that existing water infrastructure can be adaptively managed to manipulate summer flows in the North Delta. This is consistent with our predictions, and the managed flow pulse had quantifiable and meaningful effects on the overall system and food web. We've had good stakeholder engagement and agency coordination on the project. What could be improved? Well, we still need to identify and explore some of the knowledge gaps, potentially develop some pilot efforts, and we need to find additional resources to support synthesis efforts. Lastly, go with the flow. Yes, that pun's intended. Plan for the unexpected, plan early, have contingency plans, and be willing to shift priorities if the costs outweigh the benefits. Lastly, I just want to acknowledge all the management, funding, and operational support that this project has via the Interagency Ecological Program, state and federal agencies, as well as the local landowners, reclamation district managers, and water operators. Thanks.
Good morning. My name is John Bourgeois. I'm the Deputy Operating Officer for Watershed Stewardship and Planning at Valley Water, formerly known as the Santa Clara Valley Water District. But I also served as 9 years as the Executive Project Manager for the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project. So I'm going to give you a little overview very quickly of the Adaptive Management Program that kind of set the stage for the entire restoration project. For those of you not familiar with the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project, it takes place at the far southern end of San Francisco Bay. Started in 2003 with this public-private partnership where all these salt ponds were transferred into public ownership, and collectively the 15,000 acres in the South Bay became known as the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project. Again, this is what it looks like on the ground. It's a very urbanized part of the estuary, but as you can see, there's a lot of opportunities. But with that hard urbanized edge, there were a lot of constraints, and also working at this scale, there were a lot of concerns about how do we move forward effectively. And so early in the project, we determined what we thought were the key uncertainties. What don't we know about the project to work at this scale and in this particular setting? And despite all of these key uncertainties, there was one that kind of drove the structure of the project. And that's this concept of ecological trade-offs. We're obviously trying to restore some of the lost tidal marsh in San Francisco Bay for some of the protected species, such as the Ridgway's rail and salt marsh harvest mouse. But there are also species that actually like the salt pond habitat. For example, the western snowy plover here, which is federally threatened, actually nests on the salt flats. So we've got this tension set up between species that actually need the salt marsh and species that are like the existing conditions and are utilizing those existing habitats. So how do we move forward? This is actually not just a project. This is actually a program that's going to be implemented in phases over a 50-year time frame. This is a large program with multiple phases. So we actually bookended what we thought the low end of restoration and the high end of restoration could look like at 50% to 90%. But where we actually end up is subject to adaptive management. And that's where we kind of fit into this, this classic adaptive management wheel that we're so familiar with. But on the ground, it actually looks a little bit more like this for us of how we're operating day to day and making decisions. I'm going to walk you through this graph really quickly. On the x-axis, we have time. On the y-axis, we have some monitoring parameters, such as bird numbers, fish, acres of tidal marsh, etc. And we start at some environmental baseline. Now, being a restoration project, we want to do good things. We have a target. So we want to increase bird numbers or fish or acres of marsh, et cetera. So we're shooting for some target, but there's always a chance for things to go sideways on us. So we have a negative threshold of significance established, a line below which we do not want to cross, right? And that's documented in our NEPA and CEQA documents. But before we get to those thresholds of significance, we actually have a trigger to take action. And that's where the adaptive management process comes in. And in reality, once the project starts moving through an actual trajectory, it could look like any one of these things. It could be on target. It could be headed for something negative. And so we have to come up with a framework by which to address all these possibilities. And we did that through our what we call the big table. And it's called that because it's 11 by 17. It runs for like 13 pages. And it covers the gamut of all possibilities. And so really quickly, here's an example for sediment dynamics. We have the category of monitoring that we're talking about. It's linked specifically to a project objective. From there, we establish what the restoration target is, what the monitoring parameter and methods are to monitor it. What is the spatial scale we're talking about? Is this pond specific or is this regional, right? What spatial scale are we expecting results? And what is the time frame for our decision making? Is this something we can determine on an annual basis, or do we need to look a decade or two out to actually make this decision? What is our trigger for action? Like what will occur to cause us to take some corrective measures? What are the questions we need to be asking so that we can make more informed decisions? And then finally, what is the range of those potential management actions that we could undertake? And it's not just this structure, it's also with adaptive management, communicating these things out is very important. So having a communication structure, the Salt Pond Project has a centralized project management team that is the decision makers. It's linked very closely to our science team. We have a lead scientist as a liaison. And then of course, we have to communicate that out to the broader group of stakeholders and interested public. So this communication network is really important decision making. I really encourage you to attend Donna Ball's presentation tomorrow, where she talks a little bit more in detail about what are the things we've been doing. And you can always contact me at my email address here or at the website southbayrestoration.org. Thank you very much.
Hello, I'm Staci Sherman with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. I manage the Fish Restoration Program Monitoring Team, and today I'm going to talk about a few principles that we used to develop project-level adaptive management and monitoring plans, or AMMPs, to adjust program-level objectives. The Fish Restoration Program is a collaboration between the Department of Water Resources and 2 units within the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And collectively, we plan, implement, and monitor over 8,000 acres of tidal wetland restoration in the Delta and Sassoon Marsh. The restoration is required by federal and state permits for the operation of the State Water Project. And it's meant to primarily benefit listed fish species, particularly Delta smelt, longfin smelt, and Chinook salmon. Fish Restoration Program sites are scattered throughout the North Delta Arc. We have 11 of them. 6 of them have been restored in the past couple of years, and those are in blue here. The parcels in white are still in planning, and those in green are our reference sites. Each project is a major construction project, and so a slew of permits is required. For us, monitoring goes with those permits, so we need to know what monitoring to include way before construction ever starts. A good chunk of the monitoring is construction compliance. Did you follow your plans? And were your avoidance, minimization, and mitigation measures properly carried out? My team is more focused on monitoring for adaptive management of the system. And so we look at the effectiveness in tidal wetland restoration and providing fish food and habitat for our listed species. And so the monitoring that's included in an adaptive management monitoring plan for a particular project needs to be able to roll up to help us to cumulatively assess the effects of the program. It's a pretty big job. And so one of our guiding principles is to get a lot of input and to do it early and often. And so, of course, that's going to include pre-consultation with the permitting agencies. But we also have a body of scientists who are interested in tidal wetland monitoring, who participate in the IEP project work team that exists for that purpose. The work team put together a series of conceptual models and even monitoring plan guidance to help projects that have similar objectives to fish restoration program objectives develop compatible adaptive management and monitoring plans. And you can join the project work team and or get a copy of this monitoring plan guidance by emailing me at staci.sherman@wildlife.ca.gov. Our second consideration is to use all of the data that are already available to us and to not reinvent the wheel. So we made sure to look at all of the great long-term surveys that are already operating in our areas and complement them when we can. We also use methods that are as comparable as they can be while still addressing our objectives, and we freely share our standard operating procedures with anyone who would like to do the same. We also think it's really important to keep in mind the context of this really dynamic system and to make sure that reference sites are monitored both before and after restoration as well. Our AMMPs are written to cover a 10-year period post-construction, and the permits are the same. They were also written before we understood the variability with the wetlands, and so the level of effort that we need to detect an effect was kind of unknown. And so what our strategy was to maximize the numbers of samples that we could take with the recognition that we can't sample everything at the highest intensity at all 11 sites every year. And so including up to language helps us to have a little bit of flexibility. While I didn't label this a principle, the level of monitoring needed to adaptively manage a system doesn't happen without a good chunk of money and a really good team. So I thank my funders and team, and thank all of you for watching.
Good to be with you. I'm John Takakawa, Operations Manager with the Sassoon Resource Conservation District. I'm here to talk about adaptive habitat management plans in Sassoon Marsh and our efforts to update those plans. My co-author is Desiree Collins. Wetland management has been going on in Sassoon Marsh since the 1880s, but in the past 50 years, there have been strong efforts to increase the conservation in the marsh, including trying to develop individual plans for each of the parcels that was legislated in the late 70s and accomplished first in the early 1980s. However, it's been almost 40 years since those plans have been developed, and so it's been a long time since they've been updated. This is an example of an original management plan. It basically provided the information on how much acreage there was in a particular property, what type of infrastructure there might have been, and what different types of biota were involved in those areas. And so this information was used by the landowners to direct the management on their wetlands. In the update, we've chosen to increase the spatial data available to the landowners. First, we've worked with BCDC to use ArcGIS Online and provide data sets that BCDC and SRCD can use to look at infrastructure and update it as it changes, which occurs regularly, as well as providing basic information on imagery of habitats and on lighter imagery for information on elevations that we have put into coverages in ArcGIS. One of the most difficult parts of doing this type of work is to have landowner meetings, and we did so with 123 different landowners. And this was especially difficult because of COVID, so we had to do a lot of the meetings in Zoom, even though we did some of the meetings in person, depending on the conditions outside, and also we ended up doing some of the meetings just by conference calls to get the information gathered. So each plan, we included basic information on the plan map soils map, elevation modeling map, and infrastructure. And that's about 20 pages of information. We also included updated maps of aerial imagery, infrastructure, elevation, and soils. And we looked to put information that was useful for the managers in their hands. This included a template, as we call it, of an overview of what the habitat regulations were that they had to follow for best management practices for the wetlands, the regulatory requirements that they needed to know about, and also the management options they could do to alter the vegetation components on their habitats. Along with that, we provided a very large set of resources that we ended up including as appendices within the website that we have, putting in information, including forms, letters, and other kinds of information that landowners could use every year to update the information on their clubs. So now that we've accomplished all the background work, our hopes are to complete a final draft of the management plans for the first time in 40 years, provide those for the final landowner sign-off, and then forward them to BCDC for final certification. And in this way, that we've hoped that the plans are readily available for updating. And that's something I think everyone should consider as they're doing adaptive management plans, is that it's difficult to keep them up to date, and that some thought and effort should be put into having that to be an easy process. If people want to hear about our experiences, feel free to contact me at any time. I left my email here on this slide, and you can reach me to discuss our processes. Just give me a call or send me an email. Thanks.
Hello, my name is Megan Cook, and I'm the Science Coordinator for the Central Valley Project Improvement Act Program, or CVPA for short. I'm going to present on CVPA's overarching data management strategy today. And I want to thank my talk's co-author, Sadie Gill, who provides modeling and data management expertise to the CVPA program. A very brief summary of CVPA is that it is co-implemented by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Bureau of Reclamation. CVPA establishes abundance goals for the 4 runs of Chinook salmon, steelhead, and green and white sturgeon. So to meet these goals, we have established a science-based prioritization and adaptive management process, which uses a foundation of structured decision-making. My primary role is to coordinate the CVPA Science Integration Team, or SIT. This group is a voluntary collaborative team that provides scientific and technical expertise to inform and interpret a set of decision support models. And it's through this group that the structured decision-making and adaptive management processes occur. Now, the result of the Science Integration Team's process is the 5-year near-term restoration strategy, which was just completed last year and was a huge milestone for us. The strategy includes priority restoration actions for Chinook salmon and priority information needs for Chinook, steelhead, and sturgeon. Although it is intended to cover 5 years, the SIT process enables annual updates if new information improves the models, and then the subsequent prioritization process. In very brief, this is a diagram of the Science Integration Team process. So through structured decision-making, the SIT develops specific objectives and determines the best decision alternatives to achieve restoration objectives. And they do this using quantitative models. And this sort of provides the basis for the adaptive management process. Now, we know to be able to follow the entire adaptive management loop requires information for learning, and this in turn requires good data management. Now, the CVPA program over its history has admittedly not been deliberate in its data management, which has impeded this kind of learning and improvement. We're working to change that and incorporate data management considerations throughout the process. For a more detailed presentation on the structured decision-making and adaptive management process for CVPA, please tune in on Friday morning for Rod Whitler's presentation. So the CVPA data management strategy can be defined by the 2 overarching themes of transparency and accessibility. We aim to be transparent in both our processes and resulting products. And we are also working on improving accessibility of CVPA-funded data set. There are several tools we are using to support transparency, and one that I'll highlight today is our use of GitHub to publish all of the decision support models, data, and documentation. So this supports our broad collaboration and allows us to maintain version control as the models are updated and improved. Every version of the model will always be available, so you can look at older versions, see what was changed, and be very clear about how the model has evolved. And so these are online, available for anyone to access, download, and use. On the data accessibility side of things, we've made progress in 3 key areas, although we are only in the very early stages of rolling these out. So the first area is that we have adopted a common metadata standard, so there is consistent information available about the different data sets that we have. The second is in developing tools to allow the different CVPA data stewards and project managers to easily create that metadata, even if they are not data experts, and enable them to follow the best practices that we are establishing. And the third is that we've established a centralized data repository so that this data can be easily accessible to the public. We will be using the Environmental Data Initiative, or EDI, repository. And so over the next year, you'll start to see CVPA-funded data sets being added to this repository. Now, through all of these efforts, we hope to continue to improve the quality and accessibility of information that both drives our adaptive management process and ultimately leads to benefits for the species. So I want to thank you all for listening, and please feel free to reach out to myself and Sadie with any follow-up questions.
Great. Thanks to all of our lightning talk speakers. At this time, I'll ask each of you, Britt, John, Stacy, John, and Megan, to turn on your cameras, and we'll have a little group question and answer time. So if you have a question for one or more of our presenters, you can put it in the chat or use the raise hand function to get in the queue. While we wait for questions to come in, I'll start with one of my own. I'm curious to hear from any of you who presented in this session, what resources have you found that helped you in developing your adaptive management or data management plans?
Well, I can speak up. We really relied on getting together a lot of people who have interest and background in this type of work. And so I mentioned in my talk the IEP Tidal Wetland Monitoring Project Work Team. Those people were our resource. And so that was really helpful. It continues to be helpful. And yeah, so we have resources too to share as a result of that.
Thanks, Stacy.
Hi, yeah, Karen. This is.
Oh, go for it.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was thinking resource-wise, we've sort of adopted and modified a lot of the resources provided by either CAMPT or Delta Science Council, and sort of modified templates for our planning, both science and monitoring activity work plans, as well as operation work plans. And then on the data management side, we've been heavily influenced by the presence of IEP and data management practices and open science and transparency, and a lot of the new tools for reproducibility. I saw EDI and GitHub on Megan's talk. So really adopting a lot of the interagency ecological program data management practices.
Thanks, Britt. And I'll mention we've already plugged the IMET Adaptive Management webpage. We link to the IEP Data Management Plan Framework from that webpage. So if you're going there looking for resources, that's one of the things that you can find. Thanks, Britt.
Hi, Karen. This is John Bourgeois. I'll chime in a little bit too here. The Salt Pond Project started working on their adaptive management plan back in 2004. So there weren't really a lot of great resources or analogs at that time. We did rely kind of on what was in the literature and tried to look for other large program analogs like the Everglades. But we kind of had a two-tiered science approach. We had a local science team that was all the people working in the Bay with hyper-local expertise. Then we also had a national science panel to inform that process. Folks like Denise Reed were on that. to kind of give the broader perspective. So coming at it with that kind of two-tiered approach, I think really helped.
Thanks, John.
And this is Megan, and I'll add on the CVPA data side of things, similarly to what Brittany just shared, is, we've really focused on, what's open source, following open science principles and using tools that have been established and are available. So rather than inventing something ourselves, using our code, using GitHub, EDI, yes, that's, IEP has used EDI. And so we're now using that, adopting an existing metadata standard that we can kind of just use rather than create one. So we're really trying to leverage all these existing tools so they can kind of be compatible and interoperable, ideally, into the future.
Thanks, Megan. And, I think you make a great point about using standardized tools, and it's something that we've thought about a lot and that we promote a lot. Is if we are using common tools, it's a lot easier to do adaptive management across a landscape and to compare things and to combine data. And so the more that we can converge on common data repositories, common monitoring metrics, common tools, the better we are at doing adaptive management, not on just individual projects, but actually looking at lessons across a whole landscape and the cumulative effects of multiple projects. So I'll throw another question in here. This is for any of you who want to comment on it, but if funding were no object, what else do you think you would do in your monitoring or in your adaptive management program?
Well, I'll say from the perspective of being in a state agency, it's not always the funding. Sometimes it's the processes. And so, you can have money, but if you don't have the capacity to get people, or you're really limited on what you can buy or what kind of contracts you can put into place, that's kind of been an issue. So it's not just the money, it's effective processes that allow nimble work to get done, which is sometimes difficult.
Karen, I would add that, we're all working with limited resources to some extent. And so you end up having this laundry list of things you feel like you need to monitor, and you almost always are doing some prioritized subset of that. Like you can't do everything. Another aspect of it is, you're partnering with researchers often, folks at universities, whatever, and they have their own research needs, and you're trying to get a very specific management question asked. So sometimes there's a little tension of like, no, I need my funding to answer this question, even though you're asking a very interesting so like to maybe get a little more of that baseline of flexibility in that baseline research from some of our academic partners, I think would have been some nice flexibility to have with additional funding. Because, when adaptive management with limited resources, you're trying to answer a very specific management question often.
Thanks, John.
I'll add in on the data side of things. I mean, honestly, I've just put more money toward data efforts. I mean, I think it's pretty common knowledge across natural resources in general that we just don't invest in data management to the level that we need to, that matches sort of our investment in, data collection. And so, there's been data lost or it's unusable. And so really, I'm forgetting the exact number, but I know there's been estimates of, we should be putting something between 15 and 30% of our funding into data management to really utilize all the work that's on the ground. And so I think, I think there's a lot more there to data, and everybody has some responsibility in the data stewardship that they're involved in, yet it's also reality that not everybody is a data expert and can understand some of those nuances. And so being able to have, more kind of expert data folks to assist kind of throughout the process, I think would just, really leverage our existing investments and make them more usable more quickly.
Thanks, Megan.
I would second that, and kind of related to that, I think spending more money on baseline data, right? Because you're always measuring against some baseline. In ecological systems, that's challenging sometimes. For example, if you're looking at bird numbers. So really investing in some really solid baseline information to go off of. And that, to me, that's kind of linked with good data management as well.
I was going to chime in something similar to Staci, and I think our project is a little bit unique in that it's an annual strategy or action, and not so much restoration. And so it's not so much limited on funding as bodies to do the monitoring, and we do baseline monitoring, but obviously we'd want to ramp that up if we had the capacity to. And we're currently conducting a synthesis that is identifying a whole suite of knowledge gaps. And so now it's how can we start to dive deeper into those knowledge gaps, potentially contaminants is one area. And so how can we, include those in the next planning and find the resources or coordinating agencies to help us with those efforts. And ours is also unique in that we have to coordinate with other agencies and coordination with other conservation and species management. We have to rely on sort of the water year. And if it's a critically dry year, then we just do baseline monitoring and there's no action. There's no sort of reversing those natural flows during that summer and fall period. So we're limited by a suite of other conditions, not so much funding, that are really out of our control. And so we just sort of plan and coordinate the best we can to improve the system.
Thanks, Britt. That's a really interesting perspective. The limitations that are out of your control, the environmental limitations on what you're able to do. And I think that's actually true for all projects, is we can come up with the best laid plans, but then we're limited by how the water actually moves, how much it falls from the sky, where sediment goes, where species go. And we can do our best to set up what we think is going to happen and what we think we're going to be able to study. But so often we just can't predict what's going to happen until we're in it, and the environmental conditions dictate what we can actually focus our research on.
Karen, if I might comment on that, it is that monitoring is best when you do it longer term and have great frequency, and you're trying to do so where you're trying to figure out what you can start up that you can continue through time and get supported through time. At the same time, things change. We didn't have ArcGIS at all really in the start of the plans at Sisson Marsh. And so we've implemented these things. So you have to have a chance to evaluate and adapt, is both like the systems change and tidal restoration, where what survey you did at first may be completely different later, and trying to make it still comparable, or at least in some way reflect on what is collected earlier in baseline, is something that you can kind of say what the change was, even when methodologies change, technologies change. So that's really great to build in also to the programs.
Thanks, John. We had a comment in the chat from Ramona Swenson. Ramona, would you like to speak?
Sure. Yeah, no, I love all these talks here, and just trying to think about, because we're often dealing with limited resources, knowing sort of the timing, frequency, number of samples that are necessary, and trying to have some flexibility to adjust that, because also, Staci knows, all the samples you collect, you need to process, you need to analyze. And if you can maybe start at a higher frequency, but have the opportunity to adjust your monitoring plan as you see things come out, that can help people focus the resources more cost effectively and on the question the real question that you really want to focus on for management purposes. So sometimes gain that advice in the course of the, matching up the standardized monitoring techniques can be useful for project proponents as they're trying to identify, how often, how much should I budget out there for it.
Yeah, that's absolutely an issue. And like I said in my talk, you have to, you're planning before, you're permitting way before you know what's going to be happening. And in our case, when we're really concerned about the macroinvertebrates that are relatively undersampled in this system, we don't really know what the variability was going to be going in. And so we're trying to develop that information. And so I see John answered in the chat too, that it is going to vary depending on the parameter. But that baseline data is really helpful in making informed decisions.
John, did you want to comment on this?
Sure. Staci said it well. I think it goes back to my original comment about baseline data. It's really critical for you to understand, and so anything you can do ahead of time to understand what your adaptive management before you get through permitting, to understand what your parameters are going to be, and then we found that we had been able in the salt pond project been able to scale back certain monitoring efforts, but others we had to ramp up because we had underestimated the frequency. So it's that in and of itself almost needs to be adaptive as well. You need to build in some flexibility because it's without like years of really good baseline data on whatever parameter you're talking about, it's really hard. It's a challenging call to make, Ramon. I totally agree.
Great. Thanks. And it's time now to transition to our next activity, which is a breakout conversation. It'll be to keep this conversation going and hopefully give you a chance to meet some colleagues. So what we're going to do is we're going to send you all into breakout rooms now. Like I mentioned before, it'll happen automatically. If you see a join room button, do not press it. We've been having some technical difficulties with that. There'll be a 10-second countdown and you'll get whisked into the room. So don't press the button. If you do get disconnected during the transition, just rejoin with the meeting link and we'll send you off to your room. Please know that the main room will be functioning as a breakout room as well for folks that can't be put into other breakout rooms. So if you do experience a technical problem and you're looking for help, we just ask that you use the chat to ask for assistance. And then one final point is after the breakout sessions, we'll end the morning session, and for the afternoon workshops, you'll have a separate link. So you can log off of this link and rejoin us at 1:30 for your afternoon workshop if you're signed up for one of those. So I'll ask my team now to send us off into breakout.